something by Chris Hedges. Neoliberalism's Dark Path to Fascism. This is by Chris Hedges. Neoliberalism as economic theory was always an absurdity. It has as much validity as past ruling ideologies such as the divine right of kings and fascism's belief in Übermensch. None of its vaunted promises were even remotely possible. Concentrating the wealth into the hands of the global oligarchic elite, 8 families now hold as much wealth as 50% of the world's population, while demolishing government controls and regulation always creates massive income inequality and monopoly power. You do not need to slog through the 577 pages of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century to figure this out. As a ruling ideology, neoliberalism was a brilliant success. Starting in the 1970s, its Keynesian mainstream critics were pushed out of academia, state institutions, and financial organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and shut out of the media. Compliant courtiers and intellectual posers such as Milton Friedman were groomed in places such as the University of Chicago and given prominent platforms and lavish corporate funding. They disseminated the official mantra of the fringe, discredited economic theories popularized by Friedrich Hayek and the third-rate writer Ayn Rand. That's a little unfair. I think you could argue Ayn Rand is a 4th or 5th-rate writer. Once we knelt before the dictates of the marketplace and lifted government regulations, slashed taxes for the rich, permitted the flow of money across borders, destroyed unions, and signed trade deals that sent sweatshops to China, the world will be a happier, freer, and wealthier place. It was a con, but it worked. Those are powerful words and very true. And keep in mind, neoliberalism doesn't refer to liberal in the contemporary American political sense. A lot of people think that. They're wrong. Neoliberalism, when the liberal refers to the liberalizations of markets. Let's have no protections for workers. Let's have no restrictions on these corporations so they can just run amok and there's no limit as to what they can do. Let's let the market dictate. It's a very right-wing thing. And it inevitably leads to fascism because power becomes concentrated and concentrated and concentrated in the hands of an elite few. Well, the middle class gets wiped out. We don't really have a middle class in the United States anymore. We don't have it. It doesn't exist. The middle class that's left are people getting ready to retire. The baby boomers are the only remaining middle class. Let's see if there's more to this, because it's a really good article. It's important to recognize the class origins of this project, which occurred in the 1970s. When the capitalist class was in a great deal of difficulty, workers were well organized and were beginning to push back, said David Harvey, the author of A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Like any ruling class, they needed ruling ideas, so the ruling ideas were that freedom of the market, privatization, entrepreneurialism of the South, individual liberty, and all the rest should be the ruling ideas of a new social order. And that was the order that got implemented in the 80s and 90s. As a political project, it was very savvy. It got a great deal of popular consent because it was talking about individual liberty and freedom, freedom of choice. These are all those buzzwords that we use in contemporary American politics that people fall for. People bite on that. Those are what you call, so there's a rhetorical term for that, and it's called God terms and devil terms. And it's exactly what it sounds like. God term is a term that you always associate with something very positive. If someone throws that buzzword at you, it's a good thing and you should be for it. Devil terms, the total opposite. Oppression, that's a devil term. Suppress, that's a devil term. You get the idea. What are some of the God terms in contemporary U.S. society that have been there for a lot of years? Freedom, liberty. Who can dispute liberty, freedom? How are you against innovation? That's a big one. Innovation. How often do you hear, when it comes to net neutrality, why does Ajit Pai say we shouldn't have net neutrality? Well, it'll lead to more innovation. What does that mean? Nothing. It means nothing. Innovation as far as how they can price gouge consumers, how they can screw over the way you connect to the internet. But that's a God term, innovation. So that's how neoliberalism rose. All right. Let's do a little more of this and then let's move on. So it got a great deal of dissent because it was talking about all these God terms that people like. But when they talked about freedom, it was freedom of the market. The neoliberal project said to the 68 generation, okay, you want liberty and freedom? That was what the student movement was all about. We're going to give it to you. But it's going to be freedom of the market. Let's let the market figure it all out. The con of neoliberalism, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. The con of neoliberalism is now widely understood across the political spectrum. It is harder and harder to hide its predatory nature, including its demand for huge public subsidies. Amazon, for example. This has forced the ruling elites to make alliances with right-wing demagogues who use the crude tactics of racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, bigotry, and misogyny to channel the public's growing rage and frustration away from the elites and towards the vulnerable. These demagogues accelerate the pillage by the global elites while at the same time promising to protect working men and women. Donald Trump's administration, for example, has abolished numerous regulations from greenhouse gas emissions to net neutrality and slashed taxes for the wealthiest individuals and corporations, wiping out an estimated $1.5 trillion in government revenue over the next decade, while embracing authoritarian language and forms of control. Neoliberalism generates little wealth. Rather, it redistributes it upward towards the hands of the ruling elite. So neoliberalism gave us Trump. Liberalizing the markets, having the ruling elite have unlimited power. And it leads to fascism. Why? Well, because then you need someone to blame. So scapegoating happens. And it leads to a demagogue like a Donald Trump. And of course, Chris Hedges explains it in very great detail. And certainly better than I could. That's a fantastic article. Thank you for sharing.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and